So humans are by far the biggest culprits in the cause of global change, specifically climate change. And so we can see there are lots of human actions that have caused planetary problems and biological problems in our history. Just because we have a preserve in one spot now, and that's great because it's a biological hotspot, doesn't necessarily mean that that spot's always going to be great, because the planet is changing. And as environmental conditions change, organisms have to either adapt to those new environmental conditions, or they have to move to someplace they can tolerate, or they die. And so there have been several activities that lead to critical issues. So one of the first one is nutrient enrichment. And you can see here this is agriculture is the biggest culprit here. So this is going to be things like we remove nutrients from one region. So by doing massive amounts of farming, the plants that we put there soak up the nutrients in one area, and then we have to move them to another. So a lot of the time this is taking things like fertilizers and then throwing them on plants in massive amounts, so that a lot of the times when we do this, huge amounts of fertilizers run off or get washed away. And so we put way more fertilizer on plants than we necessarily need, because a lot of it's going to be washed away. And this is going to change the amount of nutrients in the environment. So critical load is the amount of nutrients that can actually be absorbed by plants without damaging the ecosystem. We typically are going to overshoot this because we know that a large majority of the nutrients are going to be washed away, and that can cause damage. So in here we have the Mississippi River Basin, which empties out from the entire Mississippi River. So all of the agricultural farming that occurs along the Mississippi River washes huge amounts of nutrients, and this is typically nitrogen and phosphate, and it's going to wash them out into the Gulf of Mexico here. So this is Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, if you hadn't noticed. So what happens here is the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in here increases. So you can see this high outpouring of nutrients in this area. This leads to eutrophication. And what happens here is, because we have so much excess nutrients in the water, we see what are called algal blooms. So we have increases in bacteria and algae. And what happens there is the algae will physically block the surface of the water, and that will absorb light, but they won't let the light pass through to the other organisms that need it below. Bacteria will also bloom, and as the algae die and sink to the bottom, those bacteria will eat the algae, and then this will cause a massive oxygen debt. So what's going to happen eventually as the result of eutrophication is we have a huge decrease in the amount of oxygen in the water. And so this creates a dead zone where there's not enough oxygen in this environment to sustain the ecosystem, right? There's a massive loss of oxygen. If you've ever walked by a lake that has a huge layer of green slime across the top, that's a huge algal bloom that's caused by too much added nutrients to the environment. We also see the magnification of toxins in the environment. So this is something called biological magnification. And this was first discovered using PCBs, as well as chlorofluorocarbons, those things in styrofoam. And so what happens is small amounts of nutrients get into the water, and they get taken up in phytoplankton and zooplankton. And then those organisms get eaten by small fish like smelt. But smelt have to eat lots of zooplankton and lots of phytoplankton. So if you look at the amount of pollutants, this is parts per million. It's 0.123 parts per million in a zooplankton. But by the time you get to the next level on this food chain, it's 1.04, so that's a 10-fold increase. a lake trout has to eat a lot of smelt to survive, right? They don't just eat one. So this is a five-fold increase in the parts per million. We're up to 4.8 now. That's about 5 times as much. And then these herring gulls eat the lake trout, but of course they have to eat more lake trout than just one. So by the time we get to the eggs, these are having 124 parts per million. So this is that magnification. As we go up, the concentration increases. And so at the bottom of a food chain, there might not be a lot of pollutants per organism. But by the time you get to the third or fourth level of this food chain, we're seeing massive amount of pollutants. And this caused problems in the eggshells. It actually made them very weak. So we started to see lots of birds dying off because they were too toxic and they were laying eggs that were no longer able to sustain life. Humans have also caused a rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. We do this by burning fossil fuels, so things like oil, peat moss, all of those things are carbon sinks. So they're sources of carbon that have been stuck in the earth for a very long time. And when you release that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it creates this layer of greenhouse gases. And this is the same effect as heating in your car. So the heat from the sun comes through the atmosphere, hits the earth, and it bounces off into space. But some of that heat gets trapped by our greenhouse gases and bounces back down to Earth. And so not all of the heat actually escapes the planet. And the thicker these greenhouse gases are, the more heat is going to get bounced back down rather than be able to escape the planet. And this is called the greenhouse effect. And this is why the release of more and more and more carbon dioxide creates more and more greenhouse gases, which creates more and more warmth for the planet. And it's not just CO2. CO2 is not even the worst greenhouse gas. Another one is methane, which is released by farm animals, so cows, sheep, pigs. And so massive amounts of animal agriculture releases methane, which is actually much more effective at trapping heat on the planet than carbon dioxide. So it's not just burning of fossil fuels, but other human activities like eating meat and creating not just carbon dioxide, but all of the greenhouse gases that reflect light back down onto the earth. And this change in temperature, so the warming of the planet, has effects on all individual organisms at different levels. So on a cellular level, we know that enzymes work at an optimal temperature. If you increase that temperature, the rates of enzyme reactions is not going to be as effective. So some organisms are going to have changes in their metabolism based on the way that their enzymes are working at their body temperature. This is why we don't let you have fevers of over 104. Once you get a fever of 104, your body starts to break down because it doesn't function at temperatures that high. Individual organisms are at risk of overheating. So this can lead to reduced food intake. So if it's too hot during the day to go out and catch food, you're going to spend less time catching food, which means you may not be as efficient at getting food anymore. Reproductive failure. A lot of reptiles use the ambient temperature to determine the sex of their offspring. If the offspring are all too hot, we end up having clutches of organisms that are only reproducing one sex. And that's not going to be good for the next generation. We see changes in growth, reproductive timing, migration. A lot of plants take environmental cues as when to flower, when to release pollen. And one of those things could be the temperature. We also see species migration. So if you think about something like butterflies eating nectar off of a certain plant, right? If the environment gets too hot, a butterfly can leave. Species will migrate to either a higher latitude or a higher altitude. They will either go closer to the poles, to the North or South Pole where it's cooler, or they will go higher up the mountain. And so if you're a butterfly, you might be able to do this. You could go up a mountain and find a different patch of flowers that you might be able to feed off of. However, the original flower can't move, and without its pollinators, it might go extinct. So we're going to see massive changes in communities and how community interactions occur between pollinators, plants, predators, prey, based on migration of certain species to different areas. We've also seen depletion of the ozone layer. So this is from the late 70s to compared to 2015. And you can see that this massive blue spot is this opening in the ozone layer. And what happens is when the ozone layer is depleted, it allows for more UV radiation to get in to begin with. So the Earth is less protected from UV radiation. And then by adding more carbon dioxide and methane, we also trap that radiation back to the planet during the greenhouse effect. So this is the UV radiation over Antarctica, and that ozone layer is much, much thinner today than it was in the 1970s. So there are steps we can take as humans to slow down this global climate change. And we have probably heard about these before. Reducing energy usage, right? Converting to renewable energy sources. Stabilizing CO2 emissions. This is a huge one. An individual person might take a bike or a bus instead of a car, or buy a hybrid or an electric car rather than a gas emissions car. Deforestation is a problem because the forests are the things that decrease those greenhouse gases. So the massive amount of burning of the Amazon rainforest right now in the last 2 years because of their new president has vastly reduced the Earth's ability to process the greenhouse gases that humans emit. I found this image, and I really like this image because it shows some of the impacts that you can have on specific actions. And a lot of the times when we hear about climate change, we hear, buy the eco light bulbs or recycle or wash your clothes in cold water. And those tend to be things that, yes, will have a cumulative effect on carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions, but generally have a fairly low effect. So they're great to do, hanging your clothes instead of using the dryer, replacing your car to buy a hybrid car. However, some of the things that we don't think about that would have a much larger effect. So a massive amount of methane is produced in animal agriculture. So eating a plant-based diet, meaning not eating animal products, has a very large effect on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So if the entire planet, which eats a ton of meat, ate less meat on general, and I'm not talking like meatless Mondays, I'm talking you maybe eat meat like once or twice a week, you're gonna vastly reduce your greenhouse gas contribution. Switching an electric car to going car free. So there's a bigger impact from, and this is from an electric car. So going from a gas car to going car free. So maybe if you have 2 cars at home, switching to a 1-car household, or riding your bike if you're able to do that. This would be to live completely car free. So rather than switching 1 car to be completely car free, so you can see she's using her bike. Avoiding 1 round-trip transatlantic flight. So greenhouse gas emissions on airplanes is extremely high. So reducing the amount of air travel would go a long way. Buying green energy. So this is talking about renewable energy. So things like solar panels or windmills. So allowing for those to provide as much energy sources as we can rather than things like burning fossil fuels. So you can see the break in the graph, like the living car free only goes up past 2, and then this last column goes all the way up to 60, would be having 1 fewer child. So the family of 2 children versus the family of 3 children makes a huge impact in the amount of greenhouse gases because that accounts for the use of an entire person's entire life. So part of the problem that we're having is the massive population of the Earth, and that we have a huge number of humans that are doing a lot of things that cause carbon emissions and release of other greenhouse gases.